Thanks for bearing with me as I test all the technology. uh, Good evening. Welcome everyone back. Um, I will try to, as usual, manage or to look at the chat box. Um, so if I miss it, please wave at me or feel free to interrupt, and I'll try to answer questions if I'm missing your hand raised. Um, it's not intentional. So I want to just welcome everybody back. It's good to see so many smiling faces, and I guess start with some announcements. Next weekend, this weekend, we'll have the movie conversation. So the movie we chose was Zen on the life of Master Dogen. I watched it for the first time last weekend. I found it very touching. So hopefully you have a chance to watch the movie. It's available for free on YouTube. I apologize. It's not. I noticed as I started watching it, it's not the highest quality video, but I was still watch it, and there's no problems with it. So it's a little long, so I watched it in two parts, which I think was actually helpful. Gave me some time to reflect on some of the storyline. And if you haven't watched it already, the movie is in Chinese and Japanese. So there's portions where is actually quite poignant, where he's talking to people in Chinese and why he does that. So if you kind of keep an ear tuned for that change in language, you might notice some more things about the story too, if you haven't seen it. I encourage you to watch it regardless of whether you're able to join us on Sunday for the discussion. Unfortunately, the movie about the founder of Shingon, Kukai, is not available online, any free sources. We do have the DVDs at the temple. We showed it about a year and a half ago. I think we'll probably show it again when it's safe for everybody to get together, so that we can do some discussion on that one. But we'll continue to do this series and choose movies and documentaries that are helpful. So yeah, that's the first announcement. The second is we'll still be online for a while. It's going to become permissible in Oregon for the temple to open again, but after discussing it, I think we're going to take a more careful approach. One of the first big outbreaks in Eastern Oregon was a church meeting, church gathering. So it does pose a bit of a hurdle or potential danger as we continue in this era of COVID. So I want everyone to stay healthy. So we will continue to broadcast online into the future regardless. But in the meantime, I think baby steps are better. So I'll try to keep you all safe. So as I joke to all the members of the board, going into the hospital is no escape from practice. So, but I don't want you in the hospital. So please stay healthy. I know there's fatigue. We're all tired of not carrying on our daily routine, but I think it's worth being cautious still. So that's all for my preliminary announcements. Are there any questions before we get started with the text? Maybe something that came up last time and thinking, or just in general? I'm not sponsored, but I discovered the Yogi tea. Their original version is actually quite nice. It's no caffeine, so if you find yourself in the store and find some, highly recommend it. Oregon company, so I have to plug them. Okay. We left off In section 3, it starts off the characteristics of beings in samsara. This portion of the text is, so I am partial to notes and outlines. So I created an outline of the Awakening of Faith. And this section, when I created the outline, I actually got a better understanding where we were in the text. So I found it was really helpful. In this section, the characteristics of beings in samsara comes after the cause and conditions of humanity's being in samsara, and comes after this idea of the storehouse consciousness. And the general chapter that it falls under is the mind and its two aspects. And this is under the mind in terms of phenomena. So I think it actually helped me going back and looking at the outline of the text to get an idea of where we are in terms of the structure, what the conversation is, and what Asvagosha is trying to help us do. And what he's trying to do at this stage, because I know we get into some nitty gritty of ideas and doctrine, and if you feel yourself falling asleep, I understand. So it can get very specific, almost like you're reading a instruction manual. But what he's trying to do is lay out for us the basic issues that we find ourselves in. And this may seem obvious a little bit to us because we have the benefit of a lot of Buddhist writings, but he's writing in a time where you might only have the sutras and there's not as many commentaries. And there's definitely, at this stage in history, not a lot of texts that just conversationally discuss Buddhist teaching. So in many ways, the Awakening of Faith is something we need, I think, in modern times. If you haven't heard me say it, I think one of the downsides of Buddhism in the West, especially in North America and English speaking countries, we have a lot of commentarial literature, and it's not traditional commentary. It's people writing almost autobiographically about their experience with meditation practice, or when they traveled to Asia or something along those lines, but they very rarely make reference back to the sutras. So that often results in us getting lost. Like, where does this teaching come from? You just have a lot of discussion, someone talking about the teaching, but you don't really know where they're getting the information from. The exact opposite was true when Asvagosha was writing. He's writing to an audience that had nothing but source texts, and they did a lot of debate regarding what it meant and where the different texts fit together. So this was a text that was trying to help alleviate some of that debate and that conversation. So if we think about it in that way, what he's trying to do with the text, I think it actually helps kind of focus in a little bit on why he has this outline style and sort of where he's taking us in this argument, and why it's important for him to answer these questions. So he's actually answering and trying to clarify a lot of the issues that came up in debate for people at that time. So that's kind of where we find ourselves. So let's see, the PDF, I'll start reading on page 33. We touched on this a little bit last time, but I want to go back over it and then we'll continue. So if you have the PDF, you can read along. In analyzing the characteristics of beings in samsara, categories may be distinguished. The one is crude, for those who belong to this category are united with the crude activities of the defiled mind. The other is subtle, for those who belong to this category are disunited from the subtle activities of the defiled mind. Again, each category may in turn be subdivided into the cruder and the subtler. The cruder of the crude belongs to the range of mental activity of ordinary people. The subtler of the crude and the cruder of the subtle belong to the bodhisattvas, and the subtler of the subtle belongs to that, the Buddhas. Another word you could use here instead of crude would be coarse. So he's making a distinction between um, coarse or rough thinking and more subtle thinking. I think if you use the word coarse in English, if you think about coarse language, it's still language, but it's not necessarily the language you want to use around your elders or uh, I can remember back to grade school and people used coarse language in reference to the teacher, and there was a certain result to that that they didn't probably didn't think they was end up in the office, but they did. So if you think about it, I think in this way, we all have very coarse thoughts. We read a newspaper article and we're incensed by it, and certain words come to mind. At other times, we are on page 33 going to 34 of the PDF. Um, at other times, we use more subtle language or more eloquent language. So I think if we think about it this way, maybe this helps our thinking about what Oswald Ghosh is talking about. But he's talking about how the mind manifests the external objects in the world to us. So when we look out of our face and we see the world, how does our mind portray the world to us? So we may think we see things exactly as they are because we all generally agree about the nature of what we see. If we point out a daffodil, we all agree on its basic color and shape. But this is a little bit more nuanced than just that. You can kind of think of it in terms of if you've lived long enough, television technology. So I've lived long enough now that gone from black and white to color to VHS to DVD and now HD and all these kind of things. And I used to think that I saw detail, right? Oh, this is a really good quality TV. I can see things very clearly. And then it progressively gets better. So you're seeing the same thing, but in more refined detail. And then I recall seeing HD for the first time, and you watch something like football, you're like, oh, you can see the blades of grass, right? This is so clear. This is a much deeper insight, almost. So this is about how the mind is actually giving us information, how we're taking things in, and what the text is telling us is that at one stage, things are very coarse due to the nature of our minds. So, however the world actually is, our mind is interpreting it and feeding us information in a very coarse manner. Somebody else, like a bodhisattva, may look at the scene and see something totally different. And enlightened beings would look at the same thing and see something else and or see it in a totally different way. We're all looking at the same thing, but how the mind interprets that information is different. So I think I gave the example last time of our current situation. So I'll use a slightly different one. Oregon and a lot of other states are soon going to be encouraging the use of masks in public to help stem the spread of COVID. And thanks to the joys of social media, I've seen people react in totally different ways. Some people are saying, oh, finally, now I feel more comfortable going out. And other people are saying, this is the first step in government oppression, and they're going to round us all up next. And so I find the reactions to the same situation very interesting. And in a way, Oswald Ghosh is talking about this in the text, that depending on what kind of mind we have, we are going to perceive the same things very differently. So it's not that we intellectually understand them differently, but how they move us is going to be very different. So this is one of the first steps in understanding the characteristics of beings in samsara. And specifically, it's talking about these first 6 levels of consciousness. So as the human body takes data in, sensory data, and then we combine that, the sixth level of consciousness, as we sort of synthesize that information, It's looking at that entire process. And one of the problems that we get into is we see everything in terms of subject and object. We make these very strict distinctions between I'm over here viewing this and this or that is happening. And the Buddhist teaching tells us that this is one of the first steps in our misunderstanding the basic nature of reality. So I'll try to use a more modern example. So we have a very good example of these things in oh, someone is in the chat has noticed that the PDF scan page versus the PDF actual page are a little bit different. That is correct. If you look at the actual page number printed on the page, those are the numbers I'm referring to, page 34, 35. But if you scan through the actual number of pages in the document, it's somewhere around page 68. So 68 of the pages in the text. So that's very similar to the original printed one. There's front matter here that are in Roman numerals that don't get added to the page number. So I apologize if there's confusion on that. So if we use an example of our current social demonstrations and what's very much in the news, our mind sees things in terms of subject object. We tend to very quickly distinguish between groups of things and start categorizing. So we have a certain social problem, but the way we discuss it automatically creates camps of people. So we discuss things in terms of citizen versus police. And by doing so, we neglect to see that police are also citizens. We see things in terms of one ethnicity or another. We see issues and concerns almost as a zero-sum game. So this is an area where we have to be very careful that in articulating ideas, we don't inadvertently divide people where there may not be a division. And the same is true for our mind. We have to be very careful that we, when we see things, there's sort of this provisional truth, provisional reality of when we discuss things, and then this more ultimate truth or reality. So this is one of the sort of basic obstacles that we have in overcoming our understanding of the world around us. So Asvaghosha talks about this process as, or discusses it as something that's coarse because it relies on our basic senses. It's reactive to sensory input and emotions. So we see things and we sort of have a knee-jerk reaction towards them. As a practitioner, we still need to identify problems. We need to temporarily and skillfully isolate and identify the immediate problem or issue. But in a debate on something like the proper role of law enforcement or human rights, we also need to identify the overall language and a solution that's inclusive. Because it's very easy to stay in the dividing and categorizing phase. So that's one of the main problems that we have. We go through the world day to day, and this shows up in the 12 links of dependent causation. And it's very much kind of hardwired into what you are, who you are as a human being. Your biological imperative, you get hungry, you go out and look for food, so you become very hyper-focused on finding the food. You are in the forest alone, you're very focused on, is something chasing me or is something hunting me for food? So this, categorizing, separating things is something that started a long time ago. So when we're trying to break free of that, initially It is a struggle. It's uncomfortable. It's a different way of regarding the world. Um, and you see that with, the very expansive perspective the Bodhisattva has. So the Bodhisattva's perspective is sentient beings. It's not even just people. It's not, gender. It's not, um, animals. It's not people in one part of the world or another. It doesn't even limit the compassion to earth, right? Sentient beings, anything with a mind. And that's something that struck me about the Buddhist teaching very early on, is this was incredibly inclusive language. So that's the Bodhisattva's perspective. But it's also true that the Bodhisattva then has to manifest in ways to save sentient beings. And that requires the Bodhisattva to understand their needs and to manifest as a man or a woman or a dog or a firefighter or a police officer or a teacher or whatever. So although their perspective is very broad, they have to still understand the course, right? So their ability is subtle. Where they're coming from is subtle. But in order to interface with us, to help us, they have to get in the mud or in the weeds and understand the course as well. For us, understanding the subtle is harder. We have a lot more of the course. We're more rough and tumble. We're living on the frontier of of consciousness in a way, right? So for us, it's a little bit different. So that's what Asagosha here is talking about. How do we understand the mind? And he's not. I think this language is more helpful than when it's translated as evil or pure or something along those lines. I think this coarse or subtle is a much better idea of what's trying to be conveyed. And you'll see more of that as we go through this section. So as the senses are more refined, they become less coarse, right? They become more subtle. So on the actual printed page on the PDF, it'll be page 34. It continues with this translator's note. So it says, reference is made to defiled states of mind in the foregoing discussion. The crude corresponds to the first three defilements of the mind, and the subtle to the second three defilements of mind. The subtler of the subtle belongs to that of the Buddhas. Does this mean that the Buddhas, the enlightened ones, still have some sort of basic defilement, even though it is the subtlest of all? This question was answered by Huan Yo, whose words were adopted by Fazong in the following way. The range of mental activity belonging to the subtler of the subtle takes place where there is no separation of subject and object. Since the characteristic of this activity is extremely subtle, only Buddhists can know about it. In the later translation of the text, this clause is omitted. So I talked a little bit last time, but this is sort of an existential question. Why are things the way that we see them? Why are we here? To which the Buddha would respond, ignorance. It also starts to get into a deeper philosophical question. What happens after enlightenment and after nirvana? Is there something left over? And we don't know because we haven't been there, but the speculation is that there is. And that is something that Asagosha goes on to discuss in more detail. So I don't want to spend too much time because, as I mentioned last time, this is one of those questions that you can spend a lot of time debating, but I think the Buddhist response would be spend more time practicing, and that's going to give you more insight than the debate. However, it is interesting to find the question raised here. Let's see. So it says these two categories of beings in the phenomenal order come about because of the permeation of ignorance. That is to say, they come about because of the primary cause and the coordinating causes. By the primary cause, non-enlightenment is meant, and by the coordinating causes, the erroneously represented world of objects. Who talks like this? So we have a little bit of what I call translator speak. So what are we talking about? We get now into a discussion of causes and conditions. So you'll hear this often in Buddhist discourse and discussions and writings, and it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about what we mean by causes and conditions. So I've often heard this almost thrown out in a way that implies fate. So someone will say, well, why is this happening, or why has this happened? And someone will say, very wise and, wizenly, oh, causes and conditions. So it's causes here, meaning causes resulting from the unenlightened aspect. So that part of us that is not enlightened yet, our unenlightened choices, perspective, create causes. And then conditions, meaning conditions resulting from our having arranged or acted upon our misapprehension. So arrange things based on the false understanding. So because we don't have perfect insight the way the Buddhists do, we do the best we can, but our actions aren't completely perfect. And based on that, conditions arise. And those conditions will necessarily be things that need to exhaust themselves, we will have to deal with later, sort out later. So this is the causes and conditions that is discussed there in the paragraph. So it goes on. When the primary cause ceases to be, then the coordinating causes will cease to be. Because of the cessation of the primary cause, the mind, disunited from the represented world of objects, will cease to be. And because of the cessation of the coordinating causes, the mind, united with the attachment to Atman, will cease to be. The basic idea here is that we need to exhaust these various causes and conditions. And the next question is, how do we affect the exhaustion, right? How do we actually use up all of the causes and conditions that we've set in motion? Do we just wait it out? Is there something more to it? Partially, and what this part of the text is talking to us about is partially this is done by seeing things more clearly. So if we have a certain amount of karma that is ripening, and we're wondering why things are happening, we can look at the situation and probably have some determination or deeper insight into that. Other things may not be immediately as obvious, so it takes a little bit of meditation on it, maybe to figure out. And at other times, we may not have insight into it, but based on having done some practice or having gained insight into other causes and conditions, we may be able to deduce that just as it was true for the other thing, it's true for this thing. So this part of the text, again, is trying to help us build a framework for understanding how the mind's operating and what's going on in the background. So these idea of causes and conditions. So that first step is seeing it clearly. And that's why the text spends time here outlining how it functions. The other part is, I would say it's not enough to just say, be a good person. So what do I mean by that? The text is encouraging us to look more deeply, right? What is the effect of our words? We should ask, when do we speak? When should we speak? Should we not speak? How do you know when to choose whether to speak up or not speak up on something? All of these things we'll get a little bit more insight into if we take a short pause. And this is one of the practical benefits of meditation practice. By observing the mind and observing its function, you'll actually eventually be able to see sort of the sensory input, and there's a small gap, and then the emotion comes up. And the more we become practiced at observing the input and trying to see if we can put space between the reaction, the more we become skilled at not reacting. And then we have a completely different perspective or frame of reference. So initially, this sounds very difficult. So someone calls you, you know, some horrible name, or does something to you, um, and later on you tell people, I just reacted. That's why I hit him in the face, right? I just reacted. Um, so there's a lot of videos like this floating around on the internet, sadly, with regard to our current protests. People seem to be driven by rage in the moment. So one of the practices, right, is observing the mind. When we see something that shocks our conscience, or something that is unjust, do we have the ability to pause, bring the meditation into that? Do we have the ability to take these ideas into the moment and actually slow down a little bit, so that we can actually choose which way we want to go or how we want to respond, rather than being this immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction? So why do I say it's not enough to be a good person? We should be looking at the effect our words have on us, as well as the effect it has on others. We should be looking at how it's affecting us more deeply, and getting insight into that. So that's going to change our behavior more than just a list of moral rules that you should follow. So we should be looking at it in multiple directions. If we believe in something very strongly, then do our actions advertise our beliefs? Do they advertise our practice? Or are we just talking about it? So all these things are things that, this part of the text asking us to think about. I think in our current situation, I've heard from friends all over the world, actually, struggling with how to talk about social issues, whether they should talk about social issues. I had a good friend from high school actually contact me and ask about whether they should speak up, how they should do it, and a lot of people have. I think in this current moment, more people have spoken out than I've probably ever seen before. I've also seen a lot of well-intentioned statements get turned back and used against people. Other well-meaning words have kind of hardened the hearts of other people. And I've seen people quickly delete posts or get attacked for their views. So the good question is, where do you start? I think looking at these texts, there's a question that's hanging out in the text all the time, which is a question to you. What is the starting point of all these texts? What's the initial insight? What's the initial conversation? I'll give you a hint. It's the first of the 12 links of dependent causation. So the first one is ignorance, is avidya. And I think it's helpful to keep in mind that one of the basic theories of the Buddhist teaching is our general starting point for anything is ignorance. It's a state of us not knowing the full story or having full insight, no matter who we think we are or how expert we are in a situation. So if we start with consideration to the unknowns, what we don't know, rather than starting from what we do know, I think that can be really beneficial. And if we start with, I think, asking that question, what don't I know? In this moment of tremendous social upheaval, I think we would learn a lot. we'd all have a different perspective. So I've really appreciated, you know, people who said, I don't know where to start. I think that's the most honest thing. Um, they say, I want to help, I want to do something, but I'm not sure where I should start. And I've urged everyone to start where they are. So my high school friend who reached out to me works for a very large, famous company. And so I encouraged her to start with that company and speaking up to coworkers when they hear things that are hurtful or ignorant or even overtly racist, and just saying that it's not something that they want to hear. I think a lot of times the silence is almost a green light for people to continue. So we're not all in the position to um, travel and march and demonstrate, but I think a slight pause, asking what we don't know, um, and then asking where we can take action is a good start. And that's true for anything. It's true for road rage. Should I say those words back to the person who's mad at me? It's true for relationships of all kinds. It's true when something is misunderstood. Um, it's helpful to ask for clarification. Did I hear you right? Rather than the immediate response. Um, so the point of the teaching here with this kind of course on subtle is each time we start from ignorance, we're setting in motion more causes and conditions we have to unwind. And this doesn't mean no action. It doesn't mean we don't do anything. It just means slowing down and looking at the question in more depth, asking what the real issue is, asking whether our perceived response to the perceived issue is even helpful. Um, so I think in this way we can really personalize the teaching. I think the teaching is supposed to be personalized. It's not meant to be an academic outline. It's meant to be something that we pick up and say, okay, this is a framework for how my mind works, and I want my mind to work differently, because some of these things are going to be a shock to us. We're not going to know that's how our mind worked prior, and if it is a shock, then even more reason to sort of pause and ask, is that how I want to continue? So I mentioned it before. When I was younger, um, I was quick to anger, and I got better with that. But it was surprising when I had insight into that, how quickly I would get um, angry with things. And I was, probably really good at grinding my teeth or something and not showing it. But it was often based on a misunderstanding or a, you know, what do they mean by that kind of perspective? So slowing down and having better insight is always helpful. Okay, I won't belabor that point any longer. Let's see. So the text goes on to the next page with a question. It says, question, if the mind ceases to be, what will become of its continuity? If there is continuity of mind, how can you explain its final cessation? So this is a really good question, and I'll try to maybe state it slightly differently. Um, if causes and conditions cease, right? So if this part of the text is saying one of the obstacles we have as sentient beings is causes and conditions. So if these cease, does that mean the mind ceases? Right. So if we extinguish, right, all of these causes and conditions, if we get insight into all of the ways the mind works, does that just mean that we poof, we're done? That's it. Maybe stated in our current social political milieu, if I don't act, how will anything get done? if the teaching is telling me to just sit on my hands, is that what I'm supposed to do as a Buddhist, right? Do Buddhists protest? Do Buddhists do anything, or do we just sit and contemplate? I think this is these are good questions. So these questions come up in practice. Um, Actually, I've seen this on uh, Reddit forums, on Buddhist forums on Reddit or something like that, where people will advocate complete inaction and just sitting with pain and social injustice. Um, that's not quite the right answer. So this question comes up, though, especially in practice and in meditation, because a lot of that is done in silence. A lot of that is done when you're alone. And the question comes up, wait, if I get rid of all these thoughts and habits, if I get rid of all the stuff that I used to describe as being me and I'm very familiar with, do I still exist? And of course, if the Buddha were here, probably say something very cryptic like, well, it depends on what you mean by I. So the text gives an answer. The text says, what we speak of as cessation is the cessation of the marks of the deluded mind only, not the cessation of its essence. It is like the case of the wind, which, following the surface of the water, leaves the marks of its movement. If the water should cease to be, then the marks of the wind would be nullified, and the wind would have no support on which to display its movement. But since the water does not cease to be, the marks of the wind may continue. Because only the wind ceases, the marks of its movements cease accordingly. This is not the cessation of water. So it is with ignorance. On the ground of the essence of mind, there is movement. If the essence of mind were to cease, then the people would not be nullified, and they would have no support. But since the essence does not cease to be, the mind may continue. Because only stupidity ceases to be, the marks of the stupidity of the mind cease accordingly. It is not that the wisdom or the essence of the mind ceases. So, needless to say, this is a very beautiful and elegant explanation of a question that confounds practitioners and meditators. And it's, as a translator's note mentions, it's a well-known simile. It shows up often throughout Buddhist commentarial literature, and even probably Bruce Lee's famous, be like water analogy. It shows up over and over. But it gives us a good working definition that the coarseness of the mind is the movement. And that coarseness leaves ripples on the surface of the water. It's not that when you cease to stir the water, that the water ceases to exist. It's the problem that we have is we've never known the water to be still. We've never, seen it placid. We've only known waves. We've only known movement. And it's difficult for us to contemplate what it would be without that when we live that existence all the time. So I think it's important here to know first what's being exhausted or extinguished. It's not the mind that's exhausted or extinguished, it's the defilement. It's not the essence, it's its coarse manifestations. And I think it's really important from a Buddhist perspective, in my opinion, because practice can scare us. If we can fear these changes in ourselves, we can have the experience of meditation where the mind becomes more subtle, the thoughts become more subtle, and that's scary. It's a different experience, one that we haven't had. And in that kind of practice, we may eventually begin to wonder who is left on the other side of this practice. We may think, will there be anything left? The text says the essence of mind remains, and the coarse states drop away. And that discourages people because they like the coarse state. They like I have a friend. I did their wedding, this couple, and the girl's very petite, but she prides herself on her cursing, and she's a real social justice warrior and always out working for things. And if every word isn't four letters and it's like cigarette in one hand, hard liquor in the other, and she's pounding the table, and you know, it's hard to imagine her not being that person. And when things slow down or there's moments of insight, it's uncomfortable. So those first stages of change can be very unsettling. Um, these are sort of major shifts in the person that we think we know. Um, and so fear may come up in practice. Um, I mentioned it before, but when I first started the temple, I remember asking my teacher if he had seen some movie that had come out. Um, it was the late 90s, so of course it was some cheesy action movie or something. And he told me no, he hadn't been to the movie theater in years. And I remember thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to do this whole Buddhist thing because I really like going to the movie theater. um, do I have to give up the movie theater in order to be Buddhist? Like, I don't know. That seems pretty boring. Like, what's wrong with movies? And now I don't remember the last time I went to the movie theater. So somehow I've become, I've emulated that aspect of my teacher. So it can be scary though, right? It may seem really mundane or simple, but it could be something that we so strongly identify with, and the idea that that thing wouldn't be important to us or wouldn't be such a have such a immediate concern for us can be scary. That can sort of be the stumbling block. So um, here it's stated very profoundly. The essence of the mind continues, but the coarseness falls away. But the coarseness for all of us is different, and um, that's something we have to look into. So the text continues. Because of the four kinds of permeation, the defiled state and the pure state emerge and continue uninterrupted. They are, first, the pure state, which is called suchness; second, the cause of all defilements, which is called ignorance; third, the deluded mind, which is called the activating mind; fourth, the erroneously conceived external world, which is called the objects of the five senses and of the mind. So it goes on to describe what those states are. So it starts off with this sentence: because of the four kinds of permeation, the defiled state and the pure state emerge and continue uninterrupted. Another way this sometimes is translated is perfuming. So if you look at the Chinese, it's actually more perfuming is the idea. So like the scent of incense perfumes a room. Permeation, I don't know, for me that sounds very scientific. Permeate, it's true, I think we use it less, but we don't usually say, I don't know, maybe it depends on who we are or the usage, but maybe I say the incense is permeated the room, but I would say maybe perfuming is a better scent, is a little bit more positive. And I think this is meant in a more uh, positive perspective. In the Similarly and above, in this the simile of with water and the movement of water, that's a very common imagery in Buddhist commentary literature. The same is true with the idea of perfuming. So I would say that's another way you could understand this, because that's going to be described later on. So it gives these four states. And so it says the meaning of permeation. So this is the first part of the discussion. Clothes in the world certainly have no scent in themselves, but if man permeates them or perfumes them with perfumes, then they come to have a scent. It is just the same with the case we are speaking of. The pure state of suchness certainly has no defilement, but if it is permeated by ignorance, then the marks of defilement appear on it. The defiled state of ignorance is indeed devoid of any purifying form, but if it is permeated by suchness, then it will come to have a purifying influence. This is the beginning of the text discussion of the production and extinction of pure and impure states, the coming into and going out of being of these states. And permeation or perfuming is a really good simile for that. So the idea is they're not destroyed. It's more the idea that whatever brought them into being runs its course. If we use the idea of actual perfume, the perfume loses its scent over time. So those volatile organics that make the perfume work eventually settle and no longer give off a smell. And I think it's a good example of why Buddhism is largely a quietist approach. So I often am asked why we don't have, I have family members that say, well, do you have services that are, like ours with the big band, and you have like a rock band kind of thing in a stadium? And I'm like, generally not. So why is that? So the imagery here is settling, right? Allowing yourself to stop stirring the water and to observe what comes next. So that you need a little peace and quiet. You need something that's going to help focus the mind rather than fill you with more agitation, more movement, more just more, right? We're going for, it's a less is more approach. So I'll never forget, years ago, I did a house blessing for a woman, and she mentioned that even though she was Buddhist, she would go to evangelical Christian services. And I was like, that's interesting. So tell me more about that. And she said she liked to go because sometimes she would get really depressed, and she just need to be, as she described it, filled up. And she said if she went to those services with the band and the music and everything, she would get filled up. And then she's over the week, she'd kind of like lose steam, and then she would go back on Sunday and get filled up again. That's really interesting. And so we talked a little bit, and in the course of the conversation, she was grasping. She needed, more and more and more, and it was hard for her to settle. And so by going and getting sort of filled up, it was whatever was bothering her was getting replaced with the excitement, the the movement, the music. It was that perspective. So Buddhism takes a slightly different approach. So I don't know if you've watched the movie Zen about Master Dogen. There's a really good scene in the movie, and the reason I recommended the movie is there's actually a lot of overlap between Zen practice and Shingon practice, and it's not immediately apparent. But Master Dogen, in addition to also studying in China, comes back to Japan about 300-400 years after Kukai returns, and many of the things he does and the way he introduces Zen practice mimic what Kukai did, but almost in a very, very skillful minimalization. So sometimes people don't see the similarities because it's deeper than the outward manifestation. But there's a scene in the movie where Master Dogen illustrates his teaching by pointing to the moon. And this is one of the reasons why we have the moon disc meditation in Shingon. So the idea is that the moon is always present. So this is what the teaching is telling us. The essential essence of the mind is always present, just like the moon. Clouds may obscure the moon. Although the clouds are there, the moon is still there. So we don't see the moon, but we know it's still there. And then we have to ask, what moves the clouds, right? So it's the wind that stirs up the clouds and brings the storms and obscures the moon for a while. But the moon, our essential nature, is still there. And eventually those clouds pass on and our true nature is revealed. The moon's phase may change, but what's visible to our mind, to our kind of coarse thinking, changes over time, but the moon is still there, still whole and pure. So we see the effects of the moon sometimes, like the tide. We don't see the moon, but we know the moon is there, right? So it's not as if the tide stops during the day when the moon isn't visible to us. So this is the same is true for our essence, the essence of the mind, or our true nature. So this is part of what the text is talking about and trying to get across with this concept or discussion of the essence and these core states, cause and effect. So one of the other aspects, if we go back up on the, if I could find it in the text, the original question, if the mind ceases to be, what will become of the continuity? Is there continuity of mind? How can you explain its final cessation? Part of this final cessation is the question of nirvana. And the Buddha attained enlightenment while still living. Then the question arises, what happens after? What happens when the Buddha is no longer alive? And part of that has to do with us having a human body. And there are some things that are different when you have a physical body than when you don't. I currently only have a physical body, so I can only speak speculatively. I'll try to send a letter or email after I no longer have a physical body. I'll tell you what it's like on the other side. So they have also what the Tesla or SpaceX, they have the internet in space now. So when I'm in empty space, I can still send an email. I need virtual BlackBerry or something. So please come to my grave and burn paper money in a paper BlackBerry, and then I'll text you. So there are some limitations that the body gives. However, from a Buddhist standpoint, these deeper states of meditation are possible even while still in the body. This is partially Kukai's theory of Sokushin Jobutsu, enlightenment in this very lifetime. So those more subtle states are available to us, but difficult to attain. What do I mean by difficult? They usually require more prolonged practice, and maybe even the retreat hut and that kind of thing. We don't have the infrastructure for that in America, unfortunately. We do have it in Asia, where people can actually do those practices. Here, we don't actually have land like that set aside. So hopefully in the future, we'll get to that point. But there is a question, somewhat unanswered, but the text does hint at it here, that after the cessation of the physical body, the mind is free of the limits. So you don't have certain sensory inputs, you don't have certain desires, like the desire to eat, you don't have thirst, you don't have those limitations. That's true. And what the text here is hinting at is, even after there's no longer a body, the mind continues. The consciousness, the continuum of consciousness continues. How it's conceptualized is slightly different between the Theravada and the Mahayana schools. So that's a maybe longer discussion for another night. We can go through all of those. But there was, in earlier days, debate after the Buddha's nirvana, whether anything remained. And what the text here is saying is it's the coarse factors fall away. Only the subtle is left, right? Only the essential essence of the mind is left. And maybe to illustrate the point, if you look at the sutras, there's a division of labor between the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. So the Buddhas only teach. They don't. So if you, this is kind of well illustrated in the Lotus Sutra. So there's conversation between the Buddhas, but the Bodhisattvas are the ones that actually go out and do the work. The Bodhisattvas are making offerings. The Bodhisattvas are posing questions or are asked to pose questions. So they're almost like the TA for the professor. They're handing out the papers and grading the tests. So I think there's something, and this is sort of speculatory because this is areas where the Buddha specifically didn't talk about it. These are the questions where he famously remained silent. But I think the indication that when you're no longer creating karma, when you're no longer, as an enlightened being, no longer creating causes and conditions, what you're doing is, my words, this doesn't really, this is like deduced from reading the sutras. You're bearing witness to the activity of enlightenment, and you'll see the Buddhas inspiring others to teach, clarifying points of teaching, but the actions, the activity is primarily left to the Buddha, the Bodhisattvas, and other, you'll see that also in the Lotus Sutra, where other deities then provide their mantras and vows to intercede on behalf of sentient beings. So that's a really complex area of discussion, but I think there's, if you read the sutras long enough, you'll start to see that pattern for the most part. I was going to go further, but I think I'm going to stop there so we can do some meditation. Are there any questions before we pause?